I'm pleased to be able to begin this last plenary session for the conference this year. I hope that your experience has been as good as mine has been, and I want to take just a moment to thank everyone who has been a part of this at the David Lipscomb campus. You have made us very comfortable. Thank you. I also want to say that I am delighted to be sitting here and entertaining the kinds of questions and comments that will be coming forward as we have an opportunity to spend this plenary session in dialogue with two individuals who have spent their careers in dialogue with questions about religion and politics. And as public servants and as members of the church, these two men have certainly been dedicated to trying to move us forward in the realm of politics and how our Christian faith relates to that. And before we get started with the dialogue itself, I want to introduce both Dr. Casey and Dr. Monsma. Dr. Casey, I have known since graduate school days in Boston when we both attended the Brookline Church of Christ there, and have followed his career at a bit of a distance. I don't think we've seen each other since those days, but it is with great pleasure that I have seen him go to be the professor of Christian ethics at Wesley Theological Seminary and also a fellow at the Center for American Progress. His research interests include ethics, international affairs, and the intersection of religion and politics. And on my right, Dr. Monsma, whom I had not met until I came here, but I have heard things from his colleagues, both at Pepperdine and at Calvin. Unsolicited, they would say, you know, Dr. Monsma is a great teacher, a great writer, and a really wonderful colleague. And those are the best things that can be said about someone in the academy. And so it's my pleasure to meet him and to tell you that he is a research fellow at the Paul B. Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics at Calvin College. He is also a professor emeritus of political science at Pepperdine. He has served as a Democratic office holder in the Michigan House and the Michigan the Michigan Senate. Sorry, it wasn't Missouri, but so I'm delighted that he will be sharing some things, I'm sure, from that experience. He's the author of several books, the latest of which is Healing for a Broken World. And to give you a bit of a sense, I think, of both his dedication to this topic and to Shaun's as well, I want to read just a final comment from his preface, where he says that he's dedicating this book to his grandchildren with the prayer that they will inherit a world more fully redeemed in all its aspects than what it is today, and that one day they too may take their place as followers of Jesus Christ, who are used by him to heal a world that is all too often still broken. A challenge, but a wonderful vocation and a wonderful calling. So with that, I want to move into this dialogue, and our procedure this morning will be that first I will ask Shaun and Steve to talk autobiographically for about 10 minutes or so, to tell us their stories, to talk about who they are, how they came to hold the beliefs that they do, what is their theological grounding, and what is their message that has come through years and years of thinking through these issues as they've walked their own path toward God. So let's begin with Shaun.
Thank you very much. Kathy, it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me first of all say thank you to Randy Lowry for his vision for this university. This is a remarkable event. It's a testimony to what Lipscomb University is doing. I also want to thank David Fleer for his stewardship, his organizational skills. We see the fruit of his work here, and this has been a remarkable conference. So thank you, Randy, and thank you, David, for all your work here. When I think autobiographically, I begin to think of names in my family because I think they tell a lot. My great-grandfather was George Washington Casey. My grandfather was John Adams Casey. So you begin to see a trend. I did the math about 6 months ago, and I told my 19-year-old son, I said, you should be happy this tradition ended because you would have been Millard Fillmore Casey. And being a millennial, he didn't appreciate the tradition. You know, he was glad it was gone. I come from a family of teachers, politicians, and Christians. And I want to sort of fill in those three blanks for you a little bit to give you a sense of why I am who I am today. My maternal grandfather was Garvin Wilson, whose hairline and waistline I seem to have inherited. It sort of skipped a generation. My mother looks at me and is stunned because she sees her father. And she's going to turn 87 next week, and we're going to celebrate that together here near Nashville. He was the sheriff, the elected sheriff of Holland Township in Holland, Missouri, which sticks down in the little boot heel of Missouri. And I was born in Kennett, Missouri, not far from Holland. It's my father used to say, with only slight exaggeration, it's the only town in Missouri from which if you drive due north, you hit Arkansas. And he's actually right. Holland Township was sort of a classic shoot-'em-up, rock and roll, cotton ginning town. There was a cotton gin, there was a general store, and there was a saloon. And that sort of defined culture in Holland, Missouri. But the notion that he was a public official, now I probably shouldn't say this in public, but he's actually a Republican. I grew up in a quite orthodox Republican household, which may shock some of the people in the audience who know me rather well. But I grew up in a family that paid attention to what was going on in the world. We paid attention to politics, we paid attention to church, at the local, the state, and the national level. I was a paper boy for many years for the Louisville Courier-Journal. My district supervisor hated me because I would read the paper before I would deliver it. And he would get calls of complaints about, where is that paper boy? He's late again this morning. And they would find me reading the paper there instead of folding it and delivering it. But beyond that, on the other side of the family, Ethel, my grandmother Ethel, who I never knew, was the teacher in the one-room schoolhouse, Blue Water Creek School in Butler County, Missouri, just north and east of Poplar Bluff. And she taught my father. And she taught all of his siblings. And we have pictures of Ethel with like the class of 27. And very powerful imprints were made upon my brain that everybody in my family taught. Between my two parents and the 5 kids, we have all drawn a paycheck as teachers. So despite the fact I grew up in this lower middle class environment, there was always an emphasis on knowledge and learning. And you couple that then with the church I grew up in, the Broadway Church of Christ in Paducah, Kentucky. I think back, the public school teachers, the school board members, the school principals that were there, that it was in the DNA of our church that we were reading, thinking, talking, studying, arguing people. And as you look, Barbara Eddards here. Barbara, I grew up with her son Steve. Barbara can tell you the number of people from my generation who went on to get graduate degrees from that church is remarkable. Theological degrees, scientific degrees. It was a place where we thought God had empowered us with brains. Let's use them. And indeed, you look back on that generation and you see that church helped inculcate this notion that to be Christian meant you were faithful people seeking understanding wherever you could find it. And so what happened to me? I grew up to be a teacher because I was surrounded by teaching and learning Christians. I remember very vividly going to Abilene Christian University as a freshman, and my older brother Michael, whom many of you knew, had told me there were people who taught Bible at Abilene who'd gone to Harvard. Who knew that you could do that? I remember like it was yesterday going to a Bible teacher's workshop the summer before my freshman year. I'd been living in Tyler, Texas, going to the Glenwood congregation, and we took the church bus, and I remember sitting in Moody Coliseum there, the Astro Church, and somebody looked out and pointed, there's Everett Ferguson. And there's Tom Albright, and there's Lemoyne Lewis. These three people who had gone to Harvard Divinity School for their graduate education. And I was mesmerized. I barely out of high school, not into college, and I was just blown away. I had no categories for the notion that you could go to the highest institutions of learning in this country and study religion. And I think I was hooked before I even knew it. And lo and behold, I fell in with those three and others, and I ended up then going to Harvard for my graduate school. But what I discovered there, and I won't bore you with all the details, but I encountered a multiplicity, but two teachers in particular, who are what I would call scholar activists. You think of Harvard, sometimes you think of the ivory tower person who only comes down for breakfast and goes back and then comes back for dinner and has no human interaction. And there are some of those folks around, I'll confess. But I bumped into two who were different. I had the privilege of studying at the Kennedy School of Government with Richard Neustadt, one of the great presidential scholars of the United States. Very much a scholar activist. Between Neustadt, his father, and his son, they worked for every Democratic president from Woodrow Wilson down to Bill Clinton. And so you walked into his office and the wall just reeked of history. And he was there. He was an advisor to Truman, to Kennedy, and to Johnson. And so his scholarly work was not limited to the classroom, but he was an activist. He was out to change the world. He was trying to put ideas into action. And then in my doctoral work, I worked with Father Brian Hare, the great Catholic social ethicist, who similarly is a scholar activist. That he's a brilliant thinker, a brilliant theologian, and yet he's a servant of the church. He's a diocesan priest. He celebrates Mass on a regular basis, works in the local church. So I was blessed to have mentors who put together the notion of the life of the mind and the life of activity, the life of involvement, and that left a deep imprint on me. So when I moved to Washington, D.C. about 8 years ago, I think I was prepped and I was primed to try and do that, to try to hold the life of the mind and the active life together in whatever way God opened up doors for me. I'll briefly close by simply saying, theologically, some people might say my theology is incoherent. I will maybe plead guilty to that charge. I've been influenced by a number of sources. But I'm attracted to the label that Hans Frey coined of a generous orthodoxy. This notion that the scholar, the theologian, lives inside the church, is deeply committed to the truths of the church, but is outwardly focused and is willing to see God at work in the church, God at work in the world, and is willing to meet any partner, any person of goodwill, who's willing to sit down and have the conversation. And in my 8 years in Washington, D.C., I've discovered that attitude, I think, has helped me walk through a lot of interesting, unusual, maybe even bizarre doors at times, as I find myself as a theologian, as a Christian, as an ethicist, talking with folk who, under ordinary circumstances, might not find their way to sitting down with a Christian ethicist. And so God has opened up a lot of doors for me. I've tried to have the courage to walk through them and to see where indeed I'm being led. I'm reminded of G.C. Brewer's old line, I just want to chop wood in my own stall. And that's sort of been my mantra. I want to be a servant of the Lord where I have been planted, where I've been located. And by the grace of God, I've ended up in Washington, D.C. That's where I'm trying to do my work. I'm not trying to meddle in a lot of other areas or a lot of geographical regions that I have no opportunities in. But I am committed to being God's servant in Washington, D.C., wherever those opportunities present them. And given this sort of strange pilgrimage, many days I sort of have to pinch myself, and I think I'm still that little kid from Kennett, Missouri, whose grandfather on one side was Garvin, on the other was John Adams, and whose aunts and uncles were Ethel and Mabel and Gertrude. I feel out of place. But on the other hand, I feel anchored because I'm part of a tradition that has told me that God will bless whatever efforts we put into if we use our gifts diligently. I'll stop there.
Okay, Dr. Monsma.
Okay, I too am delighted to be here to share this time with all of you, and I've certainly enjoyed the conference. I've learned much. It's been especially a treat to meet many old friends from my Pepperdine University days. And I would like to join with Shaun in thanking David Fleer, David Lowry, others at Lipscomb who have brought us all together and made the past few days possible. In my remarks, what I thought I would do, since I'm supposed to be autobiographical here, to talk a little bit about where I see myself at the present time in my thinking as a Christian and as someone involved in both studying public policy and sometime activist in the public policy realm. And after doing that, then I'll explain a little bit how I got to that point. So first of all, sort of 3 quick points in terms of where I see myself now. First of all, I believe very firmly that God calls all believers to be involved in public policy issues and questions of the day, and to do so as Christians, as believers. I believe this is true whether it is simply of us as citizens and voters, or whether it is true of those of us, of those Christians who are public office holders or anyone in between. Secondly, I believe there are sure biblical principles that can guide us as we try to interact with the public policy issues of the day as believers and as Christians. And thirdly, I have found increasingly that as I try to apply those biblical or Christian principles to the public policy of the day, that I am not led either consistently to conservative answers or to liberal answers. And in fact, often I find myself struggling and searching for some kind of a third way, which really cannot be labeled either liberal or conservative. Okay, if that's very quickly where I am, how did I get to that point? And I would like to sort of emphasize 3 stages or 3 influences on me that have led me to that position. And as Shaun did, I start out with my family background. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. My father was a preacher in the Christian Reformed Church. I'm not a Churches of Christ background. This is a part of the Dutch Reformed tradition. And in fact, my father's parents, my paternal grandparents, were immigrants from the Netherlands. They came, I think it was in 1902, with a family of, believe it or not, 10 children, 8 boys, and 2 girls. So my father was one of 8 boys, and my grandfather was a farmer, laborer in the furniture factories of Grand Rapids. But all 8 of those boys graduated from college. 4 of them ended up preachers, one of them being my father. I had 3 uncles who were also ministers, and 2 of them became lawyers. One worked his whole life in the State Department in Washington, D.C. The other settled in Baltimore, Maryland, where he was head of the Legal Aid Society for a while, and ended up founding and serving as the president of an organization called United Christian Citizens. So you can see just from that background, my father's family, anyway, really combined religion and politics. And I still remember so vividly growing up, whenever there'd be a family get-together, on my father's side particularly, the conversations, sometimes the arguments, always revolved around religion and politics. And from that background, number one, I early on learned to put my trust in Jesus Christ. The basics of the gospel was there from my mother, my parents, both. But beyond that, I also it was inculcated in me that we were placed on this earth in order to contribute to it, to try to make the world a better place, to try to serve others. This was just part of the air that I breathed growing up. And secondly, that there should be no real distinction between being politically involved and being a Christian, that one's Christian beliefs and one's involvement in public affairs should be all cut from the same piece of cloth. And I know explicitly my 2 uncles who were more politically involved, that their religious belief was their motivation. So I started out with that as my family background. I fast forward here actually to my senior year in college. I'll come back to earlier in college, but I want to go to my final year as a senior in college. That year, and I'm going to reveal my age here, I attended the 1957 InterVarsity Urbana Missionary Conference. Some of you may be acquainted, this every 4 years, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, down to today yet, I believe, has these very large missionary conferences at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And I ended up going that year, and it was one of those life-changing experiences. To understand that impact, you have to understand a bit about the Christian Reformed Church in which I grew up. It's very, in its own way, an insular denomination. We have our own schools, our own college, and this is the context in which I had grown up. And it was a real eye-opening experience to go to that conference and to be exposed really for the first time to the broader evangelical world, to listen to Billy Graham. And I don't know if these other names mean much to many of you. Maybe you're not evangelical enough or old enough, but Donald Gray Barnhouse, Stacy Woods, Eric Fife, and it was an amazing experience for this 20-year-old undergraduate. And since that day, frankly, I really identify more with the broad evangelical world than with my own denomination. Since then, I married a Methodist that I met at an undenominational church I was attending. I've been a member of the Presbyterian Church for about 20 years of my adult life. For about a year when I was on the Pepperdine faculty, my wife and I quite regularly attended the Church of Christ that met on the campus. But through all these comings and goings, I really identified more with the broad evangelical world, the world of Christianity today, of Billy Graham, Carl H.F. Henry, etc. Okay, going on from there, quickly in terms of my college years, I attended Calvin College. I often say there's two questions I was never asked growing up. One was whether I was going to go to college, and two, whether I was going to go to Calvin College. I just assumed this is what a good son of a Christian Reformed minister who had been president of the Board of Trustees, et cetera, would do. So dutifully, it never really occurred to me, I must confess, to do anything else. But especially in terms of today's topic, I want to stress I came into Calvin as a good Republican. I was a member of the Young Republicans Club. I threw confetti out the second-story window when Richard Nixon visited our campus one day. But I graduated as a Democrat. Now, whether I was, this is good or whether I went up or down depends on your point of view. But without going into the details, due to several professors, some of my readings, my writings, I was a confirmed liberal Democrat, as only a new convert can be committed to a different point of view than what he had when he came into college. Well, the fourth, that was sort of my third of the five I wanted to mention. The fourth I wanted to mention is, as Kathy said, I served 8 years in the Michigan legislature, and in many ways that was life-changing also, for I came to know uphand the warts that both the Democrats and the Republicans exhibited. You get behind the scenes and you meet a lot of, how do I say it, slimy characters in both parties. But you also meet many decent, hard-working, committed persons, again, in both parties. And I particularly remember the 4 years I was in the Michigan Senate. I was appointed to the Appropriations Committee, and I chaired the Subcommittee on Social Services, the Welfare Committee, which spent all of your hard-earned tax money giving it to persons on welfare. And this was pre, the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, et cetera. And the longer I served on that committee, I personally came to feel that there were problems with our welfare system. In many ways, it was dysfunctional. And I tried hard to gradually, anyway, to introduce some changes and some reforms. And I was opposed by both the liberals and the conservatives. The conservative Republicans, some days I would swear they wanted to keep the system broken so they could run against it every 2 or 4 years, raise money, send me money because we have this awful welfare system. And meanwhile, the Democrats, all they wanted to do was put more money into the leaking boat and not try to fix the boat. And I often would be rather heavily criticized by both sides. That, and there's other similar experiences from out of those years, which started not exactly questioning my commitment to the Democratic Party. Well, it did. I questioned my commitment to the Democratic Party. And then when I went out to teach at Pepperdine University, wasn't so much I was influenced in various ways by my colleagues there, but I was almost more influenced just observing the Democratic Party of California. I registered as a Democrat when I first came out to California, but halfway through my tenure at Pepperdine, I marched down to the City Hall and registered as refused to say. In good conscience, I felt I didn't want to have that Democratic label stamped on my forehead anymore. Because every time there was a Democratic primary, it seemed the whole fight would revolve around who was the most pro-choice on the abortion issue, who was most against school vouchers, and et cetera, positions with which I tended to disagree. So I think out of those experiences, although, if pressed, I would confess or acknowledge that I still consider myself a Democrat, but I hold that party loyalty rather loosely. Going to the fifth stage, this brings us much closer to my current thinking, and Kathy mentioned this book of mine, Healing for a Broken World, Christian Perspectives on Public Policy, that was published earlier this year. And when you write a book like this, it really forces you to search your own soul and heart and mind. And a couple things, really, not that they were so new in my thinking, but my thinking was really clarified. First, in regard to making a distinction between basic biblical principles, which I feel all Christians who are attempting to follow the Bible should and can agree on, but these are on a very basic level, concepts such as justice, love for one's neighbor, concern for one's neighbor, etc., and then the application of those to the current political world. And in order to do that, you have to take into account the factual situation. You reach many prudential judgments. You very well may be wrong. Christians can disagree. And I've come to feel that's okay if we disagree on some of these issues, as long as we are conscientiously trying to apply some of those basic principles such as justice, fairness, the pursuit of the common good. And secondly, I've come to see more clearly in my advanced years that public policy shouldn't be the first thing to which we turn when we see a problem in society. Government isn't the beginning and the end. I think when we see a problem in society, we need to ask, first of all, what can I as an individual do? Then ask, what perhaps with some of my fellow Christians, my local congregation, what can we do together? And then maybe ask, what about nonprofit organizations, faith-based groups? What can we, as a community working together, can do? And only when we've gone through those stages that we should begin thinking about asking, what can our government do? What can its role be? And this has become clearer to me also, and became clearer to me as I worked through the various chapters that I have in this book. So that's my autobiography, and we can go on to the next stage, Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Shaun and Steve, for your insights and sharing your story with us this morning. I want this second part of the discussion to be more interactive. And when I say that, I mean we're going to get into some issues. And as we go along, I think the best way to proceed is to raise one or two issues, and maybe two or three, and let Shaun and Steve react to those. And then we will open it up and let you ask questions. It's been a full 48 hours, or however long we've been here, and there have been lots of issues raised, and I hope you have and will be thinking about some good questions to ask. I want to also say that you should feel free to disagree with either of the two people up here this morning. Not me, since I'm not making any committal statements one way or the other, but we'll please do that, because in some ways their viewpoints may be similar, in other ways they may be different, but this is your opportunity to engage each of them in questions that you have, and you should feel free to say what you want to say about a given issue. So to kick it off, I think we'll just start with the Iraqi War and ask either one of them who would like to start to say something about their own perspective, their Christian perspective and principles as it affects that war. So, which one of you would like to open that up?
I'm glad Kathy started us off with an easy one. No, the Iraq War. I have been opposed to the war from the beginning. I really felt it was a mistake for us to go in, but I could see how some right-thinking, sincere Christians could reach an opposite conclusion. Where my big problem has been with the Bush administration's policy in regard to Iraq was really a naive assumption that if we could go into this country, remove the existing government, that somehow peace and prosperity would sort of automatically appear. They had no real game plan what to replace that government with. And I think that kind of thinking has much more to do with 18th century Enlightenment thinking, the essential rationality, the essential goodness of human beings. Get rid of Saddam Hussein. He's the source of evil, and things will go well. But of course, as Solzhenitsyn has said, Alexander Solzhenitsyn has said, the line dividing good and evil runs through every human being's hearts. And that's my heart, but it's also the Iraqi hearts, the American military's hearts. It runs through all human being hearts. And once you catch that picture, you realize that if you remove one authority, one system of laws, you have to have something else to come in its place. And I've been here again, I've gotten a little disillusioned with my fellow Democrats, a majority of them in Congress who voted for the resolution. I think they got it wrong there. But the really difficult question is, I see it now, what do we do now? To just simply pull out, as many of the Democrats have gone 180 degrees from voting for the authorizing the war to say now we should just bail out, and that's not right either. Any sense of solidarity with the Iraqi people, a concern for them as God's image bearers, means that now that we've gone in, we've made a mess of it, but I think there is an obligation, and exactly how we work this out, it's going to take time, difficult, and I think it will take a continuing presence there of some sort, hopefully a reduced presence, but yet I think our presence has to continue on.
I'm in substantial agreement with that. I opposed the war before the war, when it looked like we were going to go to war. I guess my vector into it is sort of twofold. One is, from an ethical standpoint, I'm a just war ethicist. And this was one of those arenas where pacifists and just war ethicists actually agreed with each other. The overwhelming majority of Christian ethicists in this country opposed this war, whether they were pacifist or just war. I worked with Stanley Hauerwas, one of the most well-known pacifists in the country, to try and circulate a statement of Christian ethicists against the war before the war, and we put together really a robust and diverse group of Christian ethicists to express our disagreement with it. What frustrated me in the lead up to the war was there really was not a national moral discussion. And that's in contrast to the Persian Gulf War, where we actually did have, both in the government and outside the government, a fairly robust discussion of the categories of the just war ethic in public. That was short-circuited, and I think we suffered as a result of that. It was doubly dismaying to me that sort of the last place you would have that discussion was in your church. Here I was writing on this, I'm teaching on this, I'm doing a fair amount of media. I'm at a large congregation where there are a lot of conversations in the parking lot. But kind of when you went through the doors, you couldn't talk about it. And this is not to say you're a bad Christian if you disagree with me on the war. That's not where I'm going at all. Although I sometimes felt like I was a bad Christian because I disagreed with some folks who were pro-war. But the church ought to be a place where we can have these hard conversations and still celebrate the Lord's Supper together and declare we are brothers and sisters under the cross of Jesus Christ. But I didn't experience that. And I'm frustrated to this day that that's still the case. There were a handful of Christian ethicists who defended the war on just war grounds. They're sort of in witness protection now, I think, several years later. And some of them have owned up, I think, to the lack of wisdom in their work. I live in a church where there are some people coming back from their third and fourth deployments. I don't hear as much pro-war rhetoric in my congregation now as we see, literally, the psychological toll, the toll on the families. The American soldier is bearing the brunt of this effort. And whether you agree with it or whether you disagree with it, the truth is our military is on the verge of being broken. And there are families in our churches and outside of our churches who are suffering tremendous burdens today because of that decision. Now, in terms of getting out, Steve, let me push back. I may be wrong, but I hear, I completely understand if we pull out now and just instantly the quagmire that will ensue is not pretty. But I may hear a tinge of some of that Enlightenment optimism in the notion that we can stay and we can fix it. I mean, theologically, it's not clear to me that we have the resources to fix it. I know as Americans, we want to fix things. We want to believe that every problem can be solved with our ingenuity and our energy. Part of the problem is our presence there is part of the problem. And that's not to say we face easy, clean answers. There are no easy, clean answers. Whatever the range of options are in Iraq today, from staying for 100 years or leaving tonight, are going to leave the ongoing negative impacts of our invasion. We cannot erase those. We cannot make them go away. I think a phased withdrawal over a year and a half to 2 years where we draw down to some much lower level is actually probably the most optimistic, most moral answer from a menu that has a lot of bad options on it.
And I certainly agree, basically agree with that final point. I mean, it's this whole, Christianity, I think, is optimistic. There's hope there, but yet there's a very strong dose of realism. And in Iraq, it's clearly problematic. I think most recently there are some signs that there may be hope following the surge. Even the Washington Post with its liberal editorial board had an editorial a couple weeks ago. You probably saw it, Shaun, saying, hey, things are starting to turn around, and the Democratic candidate, Obama, better start taking this into his calculations. Maybe that's overly optimistic, but I think more than anything else, what I would emphasize as we struggle through these difficult questions, such as Shaun has raised, that the first question ought not to be, well, what is best for us as taxpayers here in the United States? What is going to be best for, for me to get elected, either McCain or Obama to ask that question, but rather a real concern for the Iraqi people. And how can we be a positive influence in that country? If it means staying, we should stay. If it means getting out, we should get out. But I think as Christians, that's where our focus should be, how to encourage a more just society to emerge in Iraq, not first of all what this is going to mean in terms of us and our taxes, et cetera.
I would just add very quickly about the surge. I mean, right now we have 250,000 U.S. personnel in Iraq, 90,000 contractors, 160,000, give or take, in uniform. We can't sustain that level of personnel much longer. The reality is we don't have replacement forces unless we're going to send people back for their 5th and 6th and 7th deployments. And at that point, you're going to really see pressure, I think, within the military. So if you look at the original goals of the surge, the one goal where there's been modest progress has been tamping down neighborhood violence in places like Baghdad. But on the 4 or 5 other political goals, there's been no progress whatsoever. So to sustain, to sort of universalize that kind of peacekeeping mission would require even more personnel than we currently have. We don't have the resources. And if we're going to make a commitment to those resources, we're talking about instituting a draft. And I think there'll be huge resistance in the streets of the United States if we turn to a draft to do that.
Okay, let's shift and move to the topic that Jim Wallace addressed last night, and that is poverty. Let's talk for just a minute about both global and domestic poverty and get both of your perspectives. And you may want to go back and refer to some things that Jim said that you may agree with or disagree with, or whatever your perspectives are.
I guess I'll go first this time. I found it fascinating to sort of look at the overlap between Senator Frist and Jim Wallace. I mean, so many of us had the benefit of hearing both of them speak. And I want to talk about the commonality, because to be perfectly honest with you, if there's going to be any move towards solutions of either global poverty or domestic poverty, it's going to be on a post-partisan basis. It's not because the Republican plan is going to be in at the expense of the Democrats, or there's going to be a Democratic plan that's going to trump the Republicans. The truth is, if we're going to do the hard work, we have to find a post-partisan approach. And I picked up on that. I sensed the overlap between the two of them. And I think that's very encouraging, because we're in an era where indeed politics may be broken. And I think that's a metaphor for the gridlock we all see in Washington, D.C. between the two national parties. One of the interesting things that's going on is you're seeing people embrace this goal of reducing domestic poverty by half in 10 years. Jim Wallace is working with a number of groups at Sojourners. The Center for American Progress, where I'm a visiting fellow, has actually put out a plan that gives you 12 public policies that, if implemented, would lead to that. And if you want to take a look at that, go to americanprogress.org. It's a very detailed set of policy recommendations that would move the country towards cutting domestic poverty in half. There are now 37 million Americans living below the official poverty line. That's an increase of almost 6 million people since the year 2000. So we're going in the wrong direction. The percentage of Americans living in poverty is exactly the same percentage it was when I graduated from high school, which was a long, long, long time ago. We actually do know how to address domestic poverty. We actually do know how to address international global poverty. The issue is not lack of brain power. It's not lack of creativity. It's pretty clear you have to have all segments of society working together. Government has a role. Nonprofits have a role. Civil society has a role. Churches have a huge role. And individuals have a huge role. Nobody is saying, well, let me say this. Fewer people today are saying it's only the government who's going to solve it, or it's only the churches are going to solve it. Most thoughtful, reflective Christians and public policy people I know say it's going to take everybody's work to make that come true. The encouraging thing to me, and I'll close with this, and we can back and forth. I do think something new is afoot in the millennial generation. I'm the father of a 19-year-old. I'm the father of a 14-year-old. And in our last session, we kicked this around a bit. There is something cooking in that demographic, and also among Christians in that demographic, that signals, I think, an impatience with the status quo on global poverty and on domestic poverty. I sense an energy, a vibrancy, a willingness to entertain experiments that might actually move the ball forward on these issues. And that's coming out of this current generation of college students, high school students, and recent college students. I see it where I teach. I see it at the Center for American Progress. My hope is we may be entering into this post-partisan era on poverty, where people can come together of goodwill across a wide political spectrum and say, these things make sense. We owe it to our neighbor to offer a way up out of poverty. And that's why I'm actually quite hopeful, more so than the Iraq situation, that in terms of domestic poverty and global poverty, we may well be on the cusp of a new era where faithful, activist Christians are going to play a huge role in rolling back poverty.
Well, I hope you didn't come here this morning expecting a sharp debate between Shaun and I, because I'm afraid this is turning into kind of a love-in instead of a debate. I was searching for something I could disagree with what Shaun was saying. I am not coming up with much.
But beforehand, we decided we might have to move to baseball if we want to get into a real food fight here.
Yeah, we could argue Tigers versus, what are you?
Cardinals.
Hey, we beat you 2-1 in the last series. But anyway, but no, I especially like Shaun's emphasis that to deal with poverty, and I think this is both global or domestic, it takes individual action. And I would even put a greater emphasis on the nonprofit organizations, faith-based groups. You know, when Frisk talked the other night, I don't know how many of you were able to be here then, he talked about his work with Samaritan's Purse, Save the Children, et cetera. I think those organizations are very important. World Vision, I know various Churches of Christ have their programs overseas. These Rick Warren and Saddleback churches getting into there's just an awful lot that is going on. And here I must mention President Bush's PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief in Africa. It always takes me a moment to get it straight. But this was a $15 billion program. Here was George Bush, tax cutter, conservative, less government, And here he was coming up with a plan that would give more money in Africa and a couple of the Caribbean countries to fight the AIDS pandemic than what Bill Clinton ever dreamed of asking Congress for, or that the liberal Democrats had been advocating. The question comes, why? What was going on here? Well, I was at a meeting a couple weeks ago in Washington. I happened to end up sitting next to Michael Gerson, who is a speechwriter for President Bush, former speechwriter. He's out of the White House now, but had been very involved in this PEPFAR program. And I asked him, you know, what was going on here? What was the thing? And he said there were two things. One, that George Bush personally is very committed to this issue, just out of his own background, his own problems with alcohol, and he saw the need for this program personally, but he said also there were a host of religious groups, including many evangelical groups and evangelical interest groups that wanted to, that they would call him up, Michael Gibbs, you know, can you get us in to see the president? He would think they were going to ask, well, they want to talk about posting the 10 Commandments or school prayer or something. But he said, no, we want to talk about AIDS in Africa. And that got the attention of not just the president, but the White House staff. And they started to see, hey, maybe this is something that we should be concerned with. And much of that $15 billion has gone to faith-based groups, other on-the-ground local nonprofit organizations, rather than being simply government-to-government assistance. The only other thing I would add on domestic poverty, and this is where it gets a little harder for me to be as optimistic as what Shaun was, because much of the problem of poverty revolves around, I think, the breakdown of the family. I mean, just statistically, I hate to even say this because it could be misinterpreted as sort of blaming the victim kind of a thing. But if someone stays in school, graduates from high school, does not have a child out of wedlock, your chances of being poor in the United States are very, very small. And so personal sense of personal integrity comes into play. Now, I know, you know, there but for the grace of God go I, is the attitude we do need. If we had gone through some of the same experiences of these persons who've had children out of wedlock, who have dropped out of high school, I probably would have dropped out even earlier than they did. Believe me, this isn't blaming the victim. But on the other hand, if we truly care about the problem of poverty in the U.S., I think we have to start talking about the breakdown of the family and ways in which, and I think here the role of the government has to be limited, but to support the family, to strengthen the family. And again, a lot of that has to come more from our churches, our faith-based groups than out of government. But I think in any anti-poverty program, that has to be also a very important piece in the puzzle.
I want to thank both Shaun and Steve for their comments, their insights, and their willingness to share those with us. If we could, let's give them a round of applause for their efforts.
This has been a production of David Lipscomb University and Nashville Public Television.